for the first time, how Pat Nixon coped with the downfall of her husband and how she is today. What Julie told me will stir new feelings about this most controversial family. Pat Nixon, Watergate, and after.
Plus, you'll be amazed at the places where this lady shows up.
Who's that?
All in the line of duty, you understand. It's part of a very special relationship between Britain's armed forces and the royal family. In pictures never seen in America, the Prince and Princess of Wales. Her husband's resignation 12 years ago, Pat Nixon has rarely been seen or heard from. It's generally known that she is in poor health. But how she is today and what her thoughts are about Watergate, and indeed about her husband's entire career, are unknown except to her intimates. But now her daughter, Julie Nixon Eisenhower, has told her mother's story. And 2020, as you're going to see, has sent its cameras to visit Pat Nixon. Barbara, I know you've known Pat Nixon for quite a number of years now.
Well, ever since her earliest days at the White House, and I remember, although she was cautious in public, how warm and kind she always was in private. And now her daughter Julie has written a remarkably candid book about her mother. It is entitled Pat Nixon, The Untold Story. And what has been untold is Pat Nixon's transformation from a young, idealistic woman to a woman still strong but bruised by her husband's political career. It is also a story of how Julie and her older sister Tricia have been affected. And finally, it is a picture of a couple who throughout their lives had what Julie calls a polite and delicate relationship. We met with Julie at her home. Julie wrote the book in this house in the Philadelphia suburbs, where she has lived for 6 years with her husband, David Eisenhower, and their 3 young children. It is a life she clearly enjoys and has only temporarily left to speak about her book. The house reflects the family's long political history. A portrait of Mamie Eisenhower, painted by President Eisenhower. A collection of personal family photographs, and a particularly beautiful photograph of young Patricia Ryan, taken in the days of her courtship with Richard Nixon. Was it love at first sight?
Not for her, but for him, that's yes, because he proposed the first night he met her. And he's a shy, sensitive person, not usually impulsive, but he told her after they'd met at tryouts for a little theater play, he said, "You may not believe this, but I'm going to marry you someday."
I think many people will be surprised to know how romantic your father was. And your mother also must have been, because she kept all of your father's letters.
Yes, she saved everything. My father called Mother his dearest heart. And in this letter, he says, "When the winds blow and the rains fall and the sun shines through the clouds, as it is now, I still resolve, as I did then, that nothing so fine ever happened to me or anyone else as falling in love with thee, my dearest heart. Love, Dick."
Patricia Ryan had a very difficult childhood. Her mother and father both died while she was still a teenager. She had to, in part, raise 2 brothers, run the household, and help support the family. Later, working her way through college and graduating with honors. She became a very popular high school teacher in the small town of Whittier, California, when Richard Nixon fell in love and married her 46 years ago.
He said of her that she was kind of his ideal person, that she had the finest ideals of anyone he'd ever known. And I think throughout all the stormy political years ahead that she was a balancing person there, that he would look to her to be the one who could be the idealist.
When your father began to have his career in politics, your mother was very much at his side, campaigning all the time.
Right.
Okay. After he became a congressman, you write that he didn't turn to her in quite the same way, and that this was difficult for her.
It was. I really think that the balance in their marriage shifted somewhat when my father was elected to Congress. In the past, he'd always sought her opinions. She was right in there with him, making decisions, discussing things. But my father really looked at politics as a man's world. Mm-hmm. That may sound outdated today, but we're talking about 1946. And it was a kind of a hurtful, rough battle. And he's the type who wants to shield his wife, his family from that. And so he didn't really want her in on his political decisions as much as he might have, as someone else might have, or whatever.
I am holding in my hand.
Freshman Congressman Richard Nixon made a name for himself when he became involved in the Alger Hiss case in 1948. As a member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, Nixon pursued charges that Hiss, a former State Department official, was a communist spy. The investigation would ultimately send Hiss to prison and was the beginning of the tumultuous relationship between Richard Nixon, Hiss's liberal supporters, and the press. You write that the Alger Hiss case, which was so famous in its time, that was a turning point, and that your mother, you say, never really got over it.
It was a crack in her idealistic perception of politics.
And when you were talking to her about this book, she said to you,
she said, I want to make one thing clear to you. She said, the reason that people have gone after Daddy is that from the time of the Alger Hiss case, they realized that no one could control him, not the lobbyists, not the politicians, not the press. And from that time on, he became a target.
But he also became nationally known, and Congressman Nixon decided to try to become Senator Nixon. In 1950, in California, he beat his liberal Democratic opponent, Helen Gahagan Douglas, in a bitter name-calling race. He became the hero of the conservatives and the youngest Republican senator in Congress. Then at the 1952 Republican Convention in Chicago, Dwight Eisenhower selected Nixon to be his vice presidential running mate. But less than a month into the campaign, there were accusations of a secret Nixon fund established when he was elected senator, supposedly to pay campaign expenses, and the taint of impropriety was dogging the Nixon campaign. With the election 6 weeks away, some Eisenhower aides were advising that Nixon resign from the ticket, and indeed he considered doing just that. But his wife said, fight.
She said that, no, Dick, we both know what you have to do. You have to fight it through to the end. And my father told me years later that those were the words he really needed to hear then.
In a last-ditch effort to preserve his candidacy, he decided to defend himself with a nationally televised speech, disclosing what he'd earned and what he owed while in politics.
We have a house in Whittier, California, which cost $13,000 and on which we owe $3,000. My folks are living there at the present time. I have just $4,000 in life insurance.
She sat there as he made that speech,
I've never been able to convert.
blank-faced.
I think she was just bracing herself, and the only way to keep in control was just to be completely blank.
I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter. And incidentally, Pat's not a quitter. After all, her name was Patricia Ryan, and she was born on St. Patrick's Day, and you know the Irish never quit. Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off.
The public said, stay, sending in thousands of letters of support.
But it was bought at a terrible price for her, because my father had to lay bare their whole financial picture. My mother's so private, and it was so painful to have everything that they owed listed. She turned away to the wall. We were sitting in her bedroom, and she was at her desk, and she turned away, and she said, I can't even talk about this. Ours was probably the only honest political expense fund.
Richard Nixon went on to serve 2 terms as vice president with Dwight Eisenhower, but even though she accompanied her husband on goodwill trips around the world, tirelessly campaigning with him during election years, Pat Nixon had grown to dislike the demands of political life. Nevertheless, she supported her husband's decision to run for president against John Kennedy in 1960. It was a tough, grinding, hard-fought campaign, which ended with Nixon losing by an agonizing 0.2% of the popular vote. It was one of the few times that Pat Nixon publicly showed emotion as she stood by her husband for his concession speech.
While there are still some results still to come in, if the present trend continues, if Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, will be the next president of the United States.
When there were ups and downs and defeats and so forth, you and Tricia didn't know about it.
Oh, yes, we knew about it, but they always made us feel that nothing was going to come into our home.
There were not a lot of political discussions at home?
No, and when I look back on it, maybe there should have been more, so that Tricia and I would have understood why a classmate would say, I hate your father, or I don't like what's happening.
Less than 2 years after his loss in the 60th presidential campaign, Richard Nixon decided he would run for governor of California. His wife had severe reservations.
She didn't want it. She didn't think he could win, and she thought it was too hard on the family.
Enough already.
Enough. He'd just been through this presidential campaign. It was only a year and a half later, and she didn't think it was the right decision then.
In the Woodward and Bernstein book, The Final Days, they say it was perhaps the only time your mother considered divorce and talked to your father about it. Is that so?
I don't know where they got that. Certainly, things were not smooth in that marriage as they are at all times, as any marriage goes through difficult times. But there's too much respect on both sides. Too much behind them, too much love and respect. I just don't see that.
Richard Nixon lost the race for governor of California. This was his second major defeat in 2 years, and his patience with what he felt was a biased press corps had worn thin.
I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
What was your mother's reaction to that?
Bravo.
Really?
She
didn't say,
no.
Oh, Dick, why did you say that?
No. It was a very unfair coverage of his campaign. She just felt that they needed telling off and go to it.
What did this do to your mother at this point? All these decisions, some of the most severe defeats, the continuous, very tough press. What did it do to her? What did it make of her?
It made her a very strong person, stronger than... She's always seemed invincible to me. She just kept going forward.
But no matter how strong, nothing could prepare her for what was coming. We'll learn how Pat Nixon...
The untold story. From her interview with Julie Nixon Eisenhower, we have learned that Richard and Pat Nixon's relationship grew from his love at first sight. Pat was her husband's ideal, his inspiration. She was a powerful force that never failed him. And though she was obviously hardened to the realities of politics, we've all wondered how Pat Nixon coped with the nightmare of Watergate. As Barbara picks up the story, Richard Nixon has just lost his bid for the governorship of California.
After the defeat in California, the Nixons licked their wounds and moved to New York City as private citizens. It was 1963. Richard Nixon joined a law firm and the family relaxed for the first time. Richard Nixon became a homebody. What was he like with you and your mother? Or what is he like with you and your mother?
He's just a sweet, thoughtful person, very vulnerable person.
Very vulnerable.
I think so. And my mother, I think one reason that they've had a good marriage is that my mother's always sensed that in him and has really protected him a lot.
Were you close to your father?
Oh, very close.
Always?
Yes, and Tricia also.
Who disciplined you?
Oh, my mother. My father was really, he really, you know, he would just say, oh, I wouldn't do that, honey. I mean, that was his disciplining. It was, my mother, I feel sorry for her now. In retrospect, she had to do it all. But she was very effective. We towed the line.
But the family life in New York was not to last. It was 1965. When your father, after these rather peaceful years, said, I think I may run for president, or I will run for president, you write, your mother talked of the humiliation of defeat, and she felt she couldn't face another presidential race. What changed her mind?
I think that a theme through my mother's life has been this tremendous faith in my father. She couldn't bring herself to say, go ahead and run. What she said was, I'll support you if you decide you must run.
The country was in turmoil in 1968 when Richard Nixon ran against Hubert Humphrey for the presidency. Anti-war protesters heckled the candidates.
Now, you've had equal time. Shut up.
As we arrive in California, I want you to know how deeply grateful I am for the welcome you've given us.
It was Pat and Richard Nixon's 8th campaign. And when the results finally came in, victory was sweet.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this. Winning's a lot more fun.
But serving as president at that time was no fun.
The country was divided on the war in Vietnam. There were massive protests. It was a time of unprecedented domestic violence in the country. And on top of this powder keg, my mother and father were trying to go on as if everything was fine in America, and it wasn't.
Your father wrote one Christmas Eve, "It is inevitable that not only the president, but the first lady become more and more lonely individuals."
Yes, I think that they probably did feel alone a lot of those times. That's why Tricia and I were so much a part of the scene then. We really spent a great deal of time with our parents, because you do reach out to your family in those circumstances.
Did your father bring these problems home to your mother?
He didn't like to bring the problems home at dinner time or on weekends. He wanted happy family times. He talked about the things that had happened during the day, and he drew us in on that. He'd ask us about what we thought of this character figure and that political figure, but he didn't want to discuss the nitty-gritty.
There are some moments that are particularly touching. After a state dinner, you write about one such night.
It was one of the first state dinners, and my parents had said goodnight to all the guests, but the dancing was still going on downstairs. And I came down myself from my third-floor bedroom to get a snack, and there was one light on in the hallway, and way at the other end I saw my mother. And my father had already gone to the Lincoln sitting room to get reports on the war and make phone calls and all. And there was Mother by herself. She could hear the music from below where people were dancing, and she was moving silently on tiptoe over the parquet floor. And I just always kept that picture of her in my mind, dancing, right?
By herself.
Right.
One of the rare times that Pat Nixon had a dancing partner was at daughter Tricia's wedding. I remember that at one point she impulsively hugged your father.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the few outward signs of demonstration, of affection that we saw. Do you remember? He didn't hug her back. And I remember we all said, "Oh, look at that. Why doesn't he hug her back?" Yeah. They very rarely showed public affection.
Well, you know, they're just very private, and they didn't feel comfortable kissing and hugging in public. Some people are like that. And my mother's press secretary, Connie Stewart, told me that she would see them holding hands in receiving lines between, you know, when there was a pause in the line. And then when the guests would be moved forward again, they'd drop hands and resume their public roles. They just, you know, they didn't feel comfortable with the open demonstrations, though.
Do you think people knew her as they should?
Yes, certainly in the presidency. I think people saw her and they liked what they saw.
Patricia Ryan Nixon.
Jimmy Stewart introduced Pat at the 1972 Republican Convention, and the delegates went wild. I remember being at Convention Hall in Miami when your father was renominated, and your mother walked out on the stage. Mm-hmm. It was an enormous ovation for her. Do you remember?
Yes, it was incredible.
I stay in the wings and don't come out in front too often. So this is quite unusual for me, but I do want to thank all of you for your friendship and your loyal support.
I think a lot of it came from the fact that she had just been to China and just been to the Soviet Union, and for the first time, Americans had been able to see her on television.
China was a turning point for her. I remember how she really was the eyes and the ears for that China trip.
She was.
She opened up.
She was meeting with people whereas my father was behind closed doors in the meetings. Mm-hmm. And she was out there with the people. It was, she was an invaluable part of that trip.
Pat Nixon had at last come into her own. Richard Nixon won the 1972 election by a landslide.
The committee will come to order.
And then came Watergate.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
In all of the millions of words of testimony, there is not the slightest suggestion that I had any knowledge of the planning for the Watergate break-in.
The president says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them, for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
Why did your father install that taping system?
Barbara, he installed it, I think, really unthinkingly. It wasn't a good system. Hoover, Roosevelt, Johnson, Kennedy, Eisenhower all taped conversations and phone calls. My father's, and they taped them for historical purposes. That's why my father installed the system, for historical purposes. These tapes were never meant to be on the nightly news. And the tragedy is that they were. And that's why when my mother first heard about the taping system, she felt the tape should be destroyed because she didn't think that anyone could survive their candid conversations being aired.
Did your mother say to your father, destroy those tapes?
No, she didn't, because she was acting on an even deeper feeling. Her gut feeling was the taping system's crazy, that she can never survive the tapes. But then she was looking at him, and her reaction was, he handled all the problems in the past, the big decisions in the past. He must know what he was doing, and when he decided not to destroy them, she accepted that, knowing that he had his own reasons.
But she'd never discussed it with him.
I don't know if they actually discussed it, but she never told him, Dick, you've got to burn the tapes.
Things got worse and worse in the White House. Can you describe now that atmosphere for us? What was it like?
Well, it was really like being besieged.
How did your mother react? What did she do during those weeks?
She just kept fighting. She kept going forward. Her schedule never lessened, and that was the way she dealt with the pressure, just to keep going forward, to keep doing what she was going to do.
She acted as if it wasn't happening.
Yeah, she told her longtime friend that the press was going to write that she was getting deaf because whenever they'd called to her at the end of a receiving line, hey, Mrs. Nixon, what do you think of this or that? She'd pretend she didn't hear them.
Your father began to think that he ought to resign. He began to talk about it. What did your mother think? What did your mother say?
She felt Watergate was a political battle, and she felt if my father could remain strong and withstand the battle, that he could survive it. And so she didn't want him to resign.
You say that when he finally decided to resign, he talked to you and Tricia, and I wondered why he didn't talk to her first.
I think that there was just too much emotion there, just too much of a feeling, well, maybe I've let Pat down.
You were the one who told her.
Yes, I did. I went over to the house and I said that my father, that Daddy felt that he had to resign. And that was the only time that she really, the tears came into her eyes, and she just cried just so briefly that it was almost just a moment.
And what'd she say?
Well, we just hugged very lightly, and we knew that if we really embraced that we'd both break down. And she, you know, the tears stood in her eyes, and I don't think she said anything. But she accepted it. She knew that it was the end.
At the end, the family united and bravely posed for this strangely happy-looking photograph.
She hates that picture of all of us smiling, that one, the night before my father gave his resignation speech, because she said there our hearts were breaking and we're smiling.
The next evening, August 8th, 1974, Richard Nixon announced his resignation to the nation.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Pat Nixon didn't sleep that night. She spent the evening packing. But there was one more hurdle before they were to leave for San Clemente. The next morning, the family would have to face a televised emotional farewell as Richard Nixon bade his staff goodbye.
Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. And so we leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility.
And what was even more difficult was, and what my mother, she couldn't look out at the faces because these are people who had really worked, believed in the administration, had done good things for the country, and you know, and here was how it had all ended. It was really a tragedy.
As Air Force One left for San Clemente, Julie wrote that her mother sat alone in her small private compartment while her father sat next door in his cabin office. The Nixons would spend the next 5.5 years in exile in San Clemente. Richard Nixon was hospitalized for phlebitis and nearly died, and Pat would suffer 2 strokes. Her husband was barred from practicing law. But for her, the ultimate indignity came 1 month after her husband left office, when President Gerald Ford made this announcement.
And by these presents do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
She said that it was the saddest day of her life because she felt it was that my father, it implied surrender to his enemies.
You write that to this day, your mother's perception of Watergate is that it was partly an international scheme, or at the very least, that double agents were involved.
But I say that in the context of the suspicious circumstances of the discovering the burglars, the break-in. That seemed to be almost a setup. It was such a sloppy job. It was, there are books that say the CIA was involved in Watergate.
Well, what does she think?
Well, that's what she thinks.
That the CIA was involved?
So.
You think so, too?
No, I don't know. To tell you the truth, Barbara, it's only in writing this book that I've even relived any of this.
Julie, how did she survive those years after that?
She survived because both my parents are incredibly resilient. And what Tricia and I saw is that when one of them was dispirited, and there were moments when they were, the other one rallied. They really sustained each other. And that's how they did it.
She never lost her faith in him, though, did she?
No, never, no. She thinks he's a great man.
How is your mother today?
My mother is not in robust health. She's in fragile health, but she's in great spirits. And I think these are some of the best years of her life.
Since leaving the White House 12 years ago, Pat Nixon is not often seen in public. We took these rare pictures of her and her grandchildren last month at the family home in New Jersey. That's Julie on the left and older sister Tricia on the right, with Mrs. Nixon looking remarkably well at 74. Julie, is today Patricia Ryan Nixon a happy woman?
Yes, I think she's a happy woman. I think she has regrets, as everyone does in life. She's been through a lot. I don't know how she's lived through it all. I'd say they're at peace with themselves and with what's happened.
One of the other partners in who?
She does seem to be okay emotionally. How does she spend her time nowadays, Barbara?
With the grandchildren, a little bit of gardening, very close to her husband, and enjoying the private life, as does Julie, who says she doesn't want a political life, and older sister Tricia, in case people are interested about her, married, has 1 child, lives in New York.
Tell how her parents reacted to her book.
Well, it's interesting, because Mrs. Nixon hasn't read the book yet, but said to Julie, I trust you, whatever you say. But last night, I was at a dinner for Julie and David Eisenhower, and President Nixon was there. And Julie showed me a card that he had just given to her, and I asked if I could take it and read it to all of you. It says, interestingly, I just finished your book on the 40th anniversary of my first election to Congress. It is superb, sensitive, moving, and devastatingly honest. I don't know how you did it. It's a beautiful tribute to a remarkable woman by a priceless daughter, and it's signed Love, R.N. Not Daddy, R.N.
That is interesting, because an intimate note, but R.N.
It's sort of symbolic of the family, that great intimacy and yet formality.
Right.
Our best to Mrs. Nixon, should she be watching.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Barbara. Well, next on 2020, we have acquired still more exclusive pictures of a certain young princess. And if you think that her life is all parties and dancing, stay tuned. The Prince and Princess of Wales, many still call Armistice Day, is almost upon us. And the spirit of this day, I think, tends to unite all veterans, regardless of their homeland. In that spirit, then, a centuries-old tradition that exists in England is worth looking at. It is the very special relationship that exists between British royalty and members of its armed services. And any veteran will be glad to see that a most celebrated young princess works very hard to maintain that relationship. And once again, these new and exclusive pictures of Princess Diana and Prince Charles come to us from British television. And if you saw our special broadcast last September, you will recognize the distinctive voice of Alistair Burnett.
A light military touch in the heart of Buckingham Palace, an investiture, honouring the good and the newly great in British public life. The Prince of Wales is to stand in for the Queen, who's on tour abroad. Waiting in the ballroom at Buckingham Palace, the sword that makes a man a knight of the realm, and 121 decorations, from knighthoods to the Order of the British Empire.
1 CBE military, 15 CB civil gentlemen, 3 AB military, 6 AB ladies, 27 AB gentlemen civil.
At 10 to the hour, a detachment of the Yeomen of the Guard, the senior of the Queen's bodyguards, take up their positions on the dais. They are, in fact, the oldest royal bodyguard in the world. They've just celebrated their 500th anniversary. For the Prince, it's another chance to meet people, even if they're a bit more overawed than usual. Monarchy's always been a mixture of the formal and the personal.
Knight's Bachelor, to receive the honour of knighthood, Sir Trevor Skeet, Member of Parliament.
The music of the band of the Irish Guards gives the ceremony a palm court atmosphere. Like the Queen, he'll have a word with each of them, sometimes more than a word. The Prince has studied the list of those to be honoured, from ambulance men to actors.
Mr. Alec McCowan.
In a changing world, the British monarchy and its pageantry change little. And to many of his mother's subjects, the Prince's duties, the ceremonial, the honours list, are the very stuff of monarchy. To that end, the Prince's valet looks after more than 40 military uniforms. The Prince is a naval commander, an RAF wing commander, an air commodore in New Zealand, and the colonel-in-chief of 16 regiments. His timetable is, in part, preordained by attendance at state occasions, be it the Trooping the Colour or the Garter service. The uniforms command respect, but also demand responsibility. So the Prince has learned how to get on with people. There's a firm handshake, a look straight in the eye. He's developed a memory for the names and faces of hundreds of people, and they appreciate it. They like such gestures as the special telegram his office sent to an ex-serviceman from Lord Mountbatten's old ship, HMS Kelly.
Not at all. You got it. That's the great thing. Thank goodness the system works.
In this royal family, the military habit starts early.
You have to close your windows, there's a draft coming in.
Corporal William Windsor's uniform was a present from the families of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, the Prince of Wales's colonel-in-chief. 2 normal-size uniforms were cut down to size for the Prince's by a dressmaker. The berets were soaked and placed over pudding basins to shrink them to fit. Prince William is an energetic child. His parents think no more so than any other 4-year-old. Only the exploits of this one make newspaper headlines.
Another go, William. Come on, go down. What's this?
My jacket.
Well done.
Safer to practice his salute. The corporal and the lance corporal get on pretty well together.
Hey!
Prince Harry is less extrovert, but like Prince William, he's a keen para. He's getting into training looking after his uniform. While his brother practices his parachute jumps. Their mother's pleased by the way they play together. One of the great advantages of a few days at their country home, Highgrove, is the chance for the children to play not only in the grounds, but with other children in the area, and also to go on outings. Sometimes Prince William isn't entirely sure that's a good idea. But when a soldier is slow to follow orders, his mother has her own tactics for bringing him into line.
Quick, 'cause we're going riding. Marion won't be there. Quick, 'cause Marion will go. All right, Harry will have all the fun then. No! No, it's all right.
No! No, 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 no!
When young paratroopers permit, the princess carries out her military duties too. She's an honorary Air Commodore and Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Hampshire Regiment. Before their parade in West Berlin, the regiment gave her a special brooch, paid for by the troops.
When your appointment was announced, it was the desire of every member of the regiment, old and young, retired, just joined, that we should mark this enormously happy occasion by a present. And therefore, I do ask Your Royal Highness to accept from every one of us this brooch, which is, the design is that of a soldier's cap badge of the Royal Hampshire Regiment, and it will give us the most enormous happiness to feel that you will sometimes wear it.
Thank you very much. Sometimes, always. Where do you think I ought to put it? It's a case of find a space, isn't it? Oh, no. You wait, tell me if it's straight.
Yes, I will.
I think I'll fit a thing with it.
I think that's very good.
I think that's all right.
Yes, I think it's absolutely good.
You can't really say much else, can you? That's lovely, thank you very much. I'm proud. This looks
very well.
terrifying.
Now, ma'am, we're going to
explain the parade.
Explain the parade a little bit.
I have to excuse the royal car.
I love it.
Unfortunately, it was only red.
Is it British?
It is British. No, it's a Mercedes, actually. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a dame line, but the doors do open.
No, really cheesy.
We then drive from here and then onto the parade ground. That takes about a minute. I won't actually...
How many times do you practice this?
One or two.
One or two.
But I still could get it wrong.
The Colonel-in-Chief knew her rights. When she said she wanted to drive a tracked armored vehicle, it was organized. There was great relief, tempered by disappointment, that the learner driver just missed the press stand. In the sergeant's mess afterwards, she met her driving instructor, Colour Sergeant Jones, and his wife.
But you try and do that with 60 pressmen watching you.
I know, it's embarrassing.
Sergeant's going to make you a nervous wreck. I know.
It's all right.
He said you'd done very well. Well, he's just been kind.
Also introduced to the Colonel-in-Chief, the sergeant who stood in for her at the parade rehearsal, and the bearded sergeant who'd played her lady-in-waiting.
Was your lady-in-waiting?
She knew that. Yes, she does. Thank you, ma'am. I must say the two of you together. I wish I'd been there to see it. Well, if we ever need you, perhaps we can ring you up.
For the real princess and her real lady-in-waiting, another military assignment to look forward to themselves. As her equerry reported, the recce had gone well.
Ma'am, Anne and I went to do recce in Plymouth with HMS Trafalgar on Monday. And I wonder if we could just run through the draft programme that we've come up with. There wouldn't be large crowds on this occasion. It's very much a private visit to the submarine.
There should be nobody.
Should be nobody at all.
I mean, am I allowed, can I wear a pair of dungarees? Because it's quite oily, isn't it? Yes, it is. Dungarees are a very good idea. And also they recommend gloves. And I could do it. Yes. To going up these ladders.
Going up and down the ladders.
They are very slippery because of, and salty.
Sounds like an assault course.
Well, you might think that when you get back.
Not dissimilar, I tell you.
Off the west coast of Scotland, the men of HMS Trafalgar got ready for their royal visitor.
RFA range. 10,000 yards, that's all.
Showing 78 degrees.
The Princess, as planned, was dressed for an assault course. The first obstacle was to get below, into the nuclear-powered sub. In the junior ratings mess, the pin-ups on the wall were surprisingly modest.
Who's that?
I thought you might ask that one.
Who's that? Who does she belong to? Yours?
The submariners told the Princess they carried enough stores to stay under the sea for up to 3 months at a time.
It may change.
But then how do the wives cope with that?
Well, they have to, basically, yeah. We tell them perhaps a couple of months in advance what the submarine is doing, and so we can make arrangements and that. But anything after that is sort of all in the air. So they just have to grin and bear it.
Very special breed of wife, then, I suppose.
Yes, they are.
Must be to understand that.
Now, we'd like to show you how the periscope works, so you can have a look through it yourself. Well, down slow, and turn that to make the periscope rotate.
Oh, what's that? Is that a trawler?
Yes, for the feel the periscope go round. With your thumb, that little switch there. We're going down to the equivalent of 120 feet below the surface at the moment.
30
meters. Right, 30 meters. Not the stick, just the wheel. So it's right hand down.
Steering the submarine, the Princess found the old naval commands hadn't changed.
A bit more left hand.
Should go for weight training for this.
Left hand wheel.
At 16 knots off the Isle of Arran, she needed her equerry's cap to deal with the half gale. For the crew of HMS Trafalgar, things to tell their wives and girlfriends at home. For the royal family, a symbol of their very special relationship with Britain's armed forces.
That is a strong tradition. But I noticed something that struck me as odd. I'd always thought that knighthood could be conferred only by a reigning monarch, a king or queen. And in this case, we see Prince Charles conferring knighthood on people. So it must be that it can be delegated if the queen says so. He's practicing, I suppose.
He may have a long time to practice.
He may,
before
yes.
he becomes a reigning monarch.
That's quite possible. We should mention also that Buckingham Palace had approval of the pictures that we saw in that fascinating feature.
They both, but she in particular is always wonderful to watch. Well, next, some good news for some people you've met before on 2020. Stay with us.